Chapter 19. When Gustavo came back to the table, he smiled. "Well, that's what I call a hamburger," he said, looking at the burger salad, fries, and an array of condiments in little tubs on the edge of his plate. Dan laughed and continued eating his pasta bolognese. He looked up at Gustavo after putting a swirl of spaghetti in his mouth and swallowing it. "If you didn't pull your grey hairs off your sideburns, why did you stay so long in the washroom?" Chippewa couldn't help but erupt in loud laughter, almost choking on his food. Gustavo stared at both his companions in puzzlement. "What's got into you guys?" he asked after he had chewed another bite of his burger. He glanced at Dan. "You sound like my mother. And you," he twitched his gaze, "Chippewa. You were a laugh a minute, aren't you?" He ate some fries while Dan and Chippewa chuckled at Gustavo's rejoinder. "Listen," Gustavo went on. "What I do in the John is my concern. If I talk to myself or if I do something else, it's my business too, okay?" Dan shook his head. "Of course it is, Gustavo, but you have to admit that under the circumstances, which are far from normal, by the way, I can't help but wonder if you decided to follow some alien to another planet, maybe." "I hope you're joking," Gustavo replied, "because right at this minute I feel like I'm on another planet already, and you're right, this isn't a normal situation. Here we are after a day of this travelling through a span of 3 years. If it takes us a day every time we've got to cover 3 years, it will take us about 4 days to find Daniel." Dan and Chippewa stopped eating all at once. Dan put his fork down and turned his face to Gustavo. He peered into his friend's eyes. "What did you just say?" "I said that it will take us about 4 more days to find Daniel at the rate we're going," Gustavo replied, and then turned to Chippewa. "Isn't that about right?" Chippewa nodded. "Yes, that's about right. Unless we skip over several events in Dan's life, that's correct." "How did you figure this out?" Dan asked, still puzzled. "Did you take a calculator to the washroom and ask God which digit to press?" Gustavo shook his head. "Give me a little credit, will you?" he fixed Dan. "Before we left on this crazy trip, we figured that Dan might have landed 18 years ahead of 1988, which meant 2006. And since we left 1993 yesterday, right after Daniel was born," Dan finished for the Gustavo, "and landed 3 years later in 24 hours, we should reach 2006 in a little over 3 days, right? Is that what you meant?" "Yeah, but it all depends on what happens in the next 3 days, right?" Gustavo said to Chippewa. The latter nodded again and resumed eating. However, he is now sure that Gustavo had received that information from someone else, yet he wouldn't let the cat out of the bag just yet. Dan needed to be reined in, as it was. No need to spur him into rushing through his future. On Christmas morning, Daniel was up early. He knew Billy would still be asleep. They had an extremely busy night and they both went to bed absolutely exhausted. Yet this was Christmas morning and Daniel wanted to surprise Billy with a clean kitchen and a clean restaurant when the big guy would make his way downstairs. Yet before he started his chores, he decided to have a look under the tree. He didn't expect to see any presents, but was surprised to see 2 packages, one with his name on it. He was about to pick it up when he thought he would wait until Billy came down for breakfast before he would even mention it to him. Another thing that attracted his attention was an added figurine in the manger. He was sure it hadn't been there the day before. He looked at it closely and smiled. There was a small cat curled up beside Jesus' cradle. He really couldn't remember ever seeing a cat in any of the images of the manger he had seen so far. Since he didn't know if Billy had added it to the nativity scene while he was asleep, he decided not to touch it. An hour later, Daniel had finished cleaning the kitchen, had started breakfast, made some coffee, and had already mopped the floor of the restaurant. He was about to go up to take a shower and wake Billy up when he came down the stairs. When he opened the door to the restaurant, he stopped, shook his head, and then smiled. "Have you forgotten it's Christmas?" he asked Daniel. "You're not supposed to work today, you know." Daniel grinned as he walked over to the table nearest to the tree and put down the coffee pot that he had brought out when he heard Billy's footsteps on the stairs. "I thought it'd be a nice present for you," he replied. "How do you like your eggs?" "All right, if you insist. I'll have them over easy," Billy said, stepping to the table and sitting down, his back turned to the Christmas tree. "There's something under the tree for you," Daniel said, pointing to the second package. Billy turned around in his chair. "Why don't you open it while I get the eggs done?" "Did you buy me something when I wasn't looking?" Billy asked. "Because your money is not for buying presents, it's for your trip home, right?" "No, I didn't buy anything for anybody. I just found the packages when I got up," Daniel said, still staring at the gifts. "Okay, maybe our leprechaun got us something," Billy said, looking up at Daniel. "Why don't you get that breakfast done and we'll open our presents after we're eaten, okay?" "Okay, I'll be right back," Daniel replied, returning to the kitchen. "It's a girl, Mrs. Politano," Malou heard the doctor say in her dreams that night. In what seemed only a few seconds later, she saw Dan come to her room. He was all smiles, but when she wanted to hand him their newborn, he shook his head and vanished. Malou woke up with a start. She was drenched in sweat and breathing an exhausted sigh of relief. I'm glad I've had only 3 children, she murmured to herself. I don't think I could take another one of these dreams. She then got up and went to the bathroom to splash some water on her face. As she turned around to go back to bed, Solangi appeared before her. And the next step will not be that simple either, the angel remarked, a gentle smile appearing on her face. What do you mean? Malou asked, too tired to welcome Solangi with niceties. Delivering a child in a dream is virtually as hard as doing it in life. I realise that, Malou, Solangi said, following her to the bedroom. So what's the next step? How hard can it be? After we've been through so far, I don't think there's much more I could take. Tomorrow night, you, Stefano and Gabby will be in your house waiting for a phone call. Do you remember now? Malou sat on the bed and looked up at Solangi. She then shook her head. You mean that will be the day of Dan's skiing accident, don't you? Yes, my dear. You'll witness the whole thing this time, though. You'll see Dan on the ski slope. You mean I'll have to see him taking that horrible fall? Yes, Malou. Unfortunately, that's what you and your 2 children will have to witness. But why? Malou practically screamed. It was hard enough to imagine what happened twice now without having me and the children actually seeing it. So why should we have to do that? Don't they say a picture is worth 1,000 words? In this instance, viewing what Dan went through will help you understand the way he reacted afterward a lot better. Maybe, Malou replied doubtfully. But why do Stefano and Gabby especially have to see that? They were too young to understand any of it anyway. Solangi sat on the bed beside Malou. Listen to me, she said. Your children will be faced with a difficult future before things settle down again when you return to Florida. Things didn't settle down right away, though, Malou interposed, throwing a glance at the angel. But even when we were in Fort Lauderdale, things were really difficult for Dan. I realise that, Malou, but you'll have an opportunity now to understand what went through Dan's mind at the time. Malou nodded resignedly. You know, Solangi, Dan is such a good man. I never understand why he couldn't stop himself before going down that slope. It wasn't like he was single and carefree. He had a family waiting for him at home. Why did he take such a risk? Was he that ignorant of the risks? No, my dear, it was not ignorance on his part. Not at all. In fact, that's one of the questions that you'll find answered when you see what happened. It was a force much greater than his own at play, and the result was as you saw it. There was something that Damiano said when we first came back to our past that always stayed with me. He said it didn't have to happen on that ski slope. It could have happened anywhere. But Dan was destined to take a fall on that day. Does that mean that someone wanted to do him harm? Malou looked up at Solangi. She searched the angel's face for an answer. You should ask that very same question once you've seen the accident, Solangi replied. All of the answers are in that event. Okay then, Malou said, bending her head to look at the floor beneath her bare feet. I'll see what happened, as you suggested, and see what the answer is. But remember, Damien and I will be at your side the whole time. We'll be watching, Solangi said, standing up. And now I'll let you go back to bed. The night is still young, and you'll have a restful sleep. Thank you, Malou replied, looking at the angel disappearing before her eyes. When they had eaten their breakfast, and there were only 2 mugs and a coffee pot left on the table, Daniel raised inquiring eyes to Billy. Can we open our gifts now? He asked, almost in a whisper. Yeah, I suppose it's good as time as any, Billy answered, turning around and watching Daniel pick up the 2 presents from under the tree. Here, Daniel said. This one's got your name on it. He handed it to Billy. They look like they're the same, he remarked, regaining his seat. And they were the same indeed. As they ripped the decorative paper from around the 2 ornate wooden boxes, Daniel was suddenly nervous for some reason. You sure it's not a joke from Lucido? Quite sure, Billy said. The little guy never done anything like this in all the years I've known him. And they're the same, at least these 2 little crates are, he added, turning the box over. How do you open it? I don't know, Billy, Daniel replied, shaking the box a little. It's got something in it, though, but I can't see how to get it open. There's no lid on it, and it doesn't seem to have a sliding drawer inside it either. He turned the box upside down and examined it again closely. The little crate looked as if it had been glued shut, but apart from looking like an old trunk or jewellery box, there was a mystery about their gifts. It felt and seemed impenetrable somehow, yet Billy and Daniel dearly wanted to see what it contained.